Рабо. Да, всех пускайте.
Is it okay now? The background?
Yes, it is okay.
Okay.
Can start, right?
So already, yes, we are starting.
Yeah, we have our colleagues also join.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dalal Aassouli. I'm an assistant professor of Islamic and Sustainable Finance at Hamad Bin Khalifa University in Qatar. I have the pleasure to welcome you all again for this second webinar as part of the Food Security and Sustainable Development webinar, Food Security and Sustainable Development webinar series, which is a joint collaboration between the Islamic Organization for Food Security and Hamad Bin Khalifa University. In this food security and webinar series, we're trying to shed the light and discuss emerging issues when it comes to food security. Our first webinar was focusing on economic diversification and food security in the context of GCC. And we thank you all for participating and sharing your insights even after the webinar. In today's webinar, we will be talking about another interesting topic, which is mobilizing finance for sustainable agriculture and agricultural productivity. But before going into the details of the session, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Ismail to open up this session and share his insights from the perspective of the IOFS. Dr. Ismail, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Dalal. Thank you for giving me the floor. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Have a good morning and a good afternoon. And we are happy to welcome you from this cooperation between the Islamic Organization for Food Security and the Hamad Bin Khalifa University. And it is a conducting of a series of webinars. And we are focusing on food security and sustainable development. Actually, the series of emerging as a critical forum to address the challenge of food security and sustainable development. The urgency of the topic is highlighted by the specific challenges faced by OIC member countries, including water scarcity, geopolitical conflicts, rapid population growth, and varied climatic conditions, and the intensify the need for sustainable agriculture practices. Today webinar is entitled Mobilizing Finance for Sustainable Agriculture and Agricultural Productivity. And if you allow me to introduce our energetic moderator today, Dr. Dalal Aassouli, and she is as an assistant professor of Islamic and Sustainable Finance at Hamad Bin Khalifa University in Qatar. She was previously a visiting academic at the Durham Center for Islamic Economics and Finance, Durham University Business School. Prior to that, she worked at the International Islamic Liquidity Management Corporation, ILM, in Malaysia, where she assisted with the establishment of the IILM Sukuk program. Before that, she held several corporate finance positions in Europe, where she had exposure to the African, European, and Latin American markets. And Dr. Dalal serves on several industry working groups and the nonprofit global forum, such as CIPA-FI Sustainability Working Group, Qatar Financial Center, Islamic Finance Task Force, and the Global Impact FinTech, GIFT Forum. She is also an invited speaker in international conferences and events and provides her consultancy experience to various organizations on issue related to sustainable and Islamic finance. Dr. Dalal holds masters from Newma Business School and Paris University and a PhD from ENS de Lyon in France. Her areas of research interest include Islamic finance in general and its implications for liquidity management, cooperation finance, ethical finance, development finance, green finance, food security, and sustainable development and social response investing. We are happy to have in IOFS that we are cooperating with Hamad Bin Khalifa University, and particularly to cooperate with Dr. Dalal with the very solid background and also optimistic and future, which we are happy in IOFS for this kind of cooperation. Allow me to give the floor to Dr. Dalal. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ismail, and I'm very pleased to collaborate with IOFS. I think IOFS has been a platform so far for knowledge sharing and for disseminating, technical assistance and also capacity building and awareness in general to member countries. And hopefully we will have very fruitful discussions from this webinar and of course the upcoming webinars. So please stay tuned for more interesting initiatives to come in the future. In today's webinar, I have the pleasure to welcome 7 distinguished panelists who come from various backgrounds. And when looking at the global landscape and how the global economy is actually confronted with various challenges, from agricultural greenhouse gas emissions to escalating deforestation rates, heightened climate change susceptibility, and habitat loss, all of these challenges present serious challenges and also opportunities for the agri-food systems worldwide. These risks not only imperil food security, but also cast a shadow on financial stability. Amidst these challenges and pressing concerns, key stakeholders in the agricultural food system confront the task of financing a sustainable transformation towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. This raises several questions. How can policymakers mobilize financing for sustainable agriculture? And how can they leverage on the emerging trends of sustainability, digitalization, but also the very expanding market of Islamic finance? What partnerships need to be developed to support this transition? And what risk mitigation and resilience mechanisms need to be implemented in order to promote food security globally? And how can aligning sustainable finance, Islamic finance, and digitalization scale up financing mobilization for sustainable agriculture and agriculture productivity? All of these questions will be discussed in today's panel with very experienced panelists who come from various backgrounds. In today's webinar, we try to actually bring in various set of expertise from policymakers to multilaterals, private sector organizations, and also critical or important organizations that work on promoting standardization and harmonization at the global level. I have the pleasure to welcome Dr. Sabine Laurent, who is a market intelligence transition lead from the Climate Bond Initiative. Dr. Sabine is a physicist and finance quantitative researcher who is passionate about science-backed initiatives to transition to a sustainable economy. She comes with a very rich industry experience from JP Morgan Chase, also as a lecturer at Paris Descartes University, and has been working with the Climate Bond Initiative as a quantitative researcher for fixed income market risk and model validation. Dr. Sabine, welcome to the panel. We also have the pleasure to have Ms. Sarah Thafi, who is a Nature Finance Lead for the Investment Leaders Group and Banking Environment Initiative. Dr. Sarah comes from the Cambridge Sustainable Finance Institute. And she also has a very interesting background, particularly focusing on the intersection of economic progress and sustainability. She'll be sharing her insights from what CISL has done when it comes to nature finance solutions. We also have Mr. Corné, who is a program director at Rabo Partnerships Advisory Services. He has over 35 years of experience at Rabo Partnerships. He has a thorough understanding of food and agribusiness, related issues and challenges. He has been working on agribusiness strategies for leading banks in emerging markets. From working on, for example, rural programs to blended finance strategies to even aspects of digitalization globally, ranging from countries in Europe, in Africa, etc., and of course Asia as well. So, Mr. Corné, we're very excited to hear about your experience. From the multilateral side, we have Mr. Wahyu Wijanyanto, who is an operations team leader, agriculture infrastructure sector in Central Asia region from the Islamic Development Bank at the regional hub in Almaty, Kazakhstan. Mr. Wahyu comes from a very rich industry experience with exposure to markets under IDB, obviously, but Turkey, Iran, Azerbaijan as well. And prior to joining IDB, he had exposure to the private sector at General Electric, particularly GE Finance subsidiary. From the same organization, but the trade finance arm, ITFC, we have the pleasure to welcome Dr. Harun Selik, who is a senior expert, trade solutions complex. Dr. Harun leads, the trade finance operations at ITFC and has been with the Islamic Development Bank since 2006 and late transferred to ITFC. And since then, he has been working in various areas such as strategy, business innovation, trade finance, and he managed the ITFC portfolio relationships with Pakistan, Bangladesh, Turkey, and Albania. From the IOFS side, our dear partner, we have Mr. Azamat Kamiev, who is a program manager at IOFS, and who started his career at the Ministry of Agriculture at the Republic of Kazakhstan, whereby he led the development, implementation, and monitoring of state support measures, financial instruments, and all are geared towards enhancing farmers' access to credit resources and investments. And last but not least, we have Mr. Conor Murphy, who has over 30 years experience in banking and finance, working with leading accounting firms and global consultancy firms. He has worked and advised on trade and investment transactions, tech startups, mineral mining enterprises, and he has expertise in business strategy, finance and risk management, as well as corporate governance. So welcome to all the panelists, and I look forward to a fruitful discussion with all of you. So to start this session with a general question to the entire panel, a sustainable and productive agri-food system that supports food security and the environment is critical, yet faces considerable financing gaps. From your perspective, what do you see as the biggest barriers or roadblocks right now to mobilizing the public and private capital needed to transform agriculture globally into a sustainable path in line with the SDGs? And I start with Dr. Sabine.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting Climate Bond Initiative to this excellent initiative. I would say that the first question to ask is, what are these practices that can make sure that the agricultural production is resilient, is sustainable, and can still ensure food security? This would be probably the first roadblock.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sabine. Ms. Sarah?
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting CISL to this wonderful panel discussion today. I would say there's kind of two barriers at a high level that I think are key to consider. One is the twinned crisis of climate change and nature loss, understanding that they are exacerbating one another, and there's instances where they're being treated in isolation, which is not capturing the full extent of the risk or opportunity related to both. So I think that's a key piece when we think of the different approaches to financing nature, is understanding the interplay of nature and climate. But I would say secondly to this is overall the financial architecture, international financial architecture system, and understanding the debt sustainability for different emerging markets, recognizing that the interest cost on external borrowing for developing countries is 3 times higher than that of developed countries. And similar to that, the cost of capital itself being more expensive. And we know that in order to scale financing to really meet the goals of the SDGs, we need to be unlocking a lot more financing to support these initiatives. So these are kind of the 2 big blocks that we're seeing right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And hopefully through this webinar, we'll have a good understanding of the financial architecture that you mentioned. Then I'll come back to you. I know you have a lot of experience, as I said, when it comes to the nexus between climate and nature. So I'll come back to you to further discuss this point. Mr. Corné, I think you have a very, very rich experience and with exposure to really Europe, Africa, Asia. From your perspective, if you were to summarize some of the key challenges you face when discussing about, the development of sustainable and productive agri-systems.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here. I would like to address 3 key barriers for this webinar. First of all, funding. Secondly, affordability. And finally, the different languages between food and financial partners. Starting with the first one, funding. It's indeed related to the interest costs, but also my concern is the depreciation of many currencies, which makes third-party funding quite expensive, because there should be a partner paying for the loss of the value of a particular currency. Secondly, affordability. What you see, for instance, in the fertilizer market is that the international prices came down to the normal levels. However, in many African countries, you see that the fertilizer prices are still high. So the affordability for farmers to pay for high input, high output systems is still a challenge. And finally, what I have experienced is that financial partners speak a different language from the food and agribusiness partners. Not only the big items, but also small things. Farmers are looking for finance, and if they have the opportunity to get finance, they will sign off an offer. At the same time, they don't know the responsibilities because it's all in bankers' language. And I think the offers have to be translated into farmers' language. A small item, but you see it adds up. And in the end, both systems do not speak the same language.
These are excellent points. And I think I'll come back to this difference in language, definitely, which also applies to some other underprivileged groups like SMEs, women entrepreneurs, etc. And it's definitely a key area that requires policymakers' attention. We'll talk about it under partnerships and how can we strengthen this point. I would like to hear Mr. Wahyu's perspective. I think you come from IDB, which is a multilateral organization, so a very perspective on how they support member countries. But from your experience, where do you see some of the key challenges facing member countries in scaling up agri-food systems and agricultural productivity?
Thank you. Thank you for having me as well. Yes, indeed, the Islamic Development Bank has been supporting the agriculture and rural development sector for quite some time across the 57 member countries. And in our experience working directly with the stakeholders on the field, we are still seeing at least 3 major barriers. The first barrier is related to the lack of financial incentives, especially for the private capital, to support the sector. The sustainable agriculture, as we know, this requires a long-term and broader perspective and a direct engagement with the stakeholders on the field, like farmers, which could be very costly. Meanwhile, the current practice of the private and commercial financial system, they still prioritize, the short-term profits and high yields. And this is one of the reasons why the commercial finance in agriculture, they are still targeting the agribusinesses, but not the small-scale farmers. The second issue is related to the supply chains within the agriculture sector, which are still fragmented. And this fragmentation in the agriculture supply chain, especially at the farmers level, this creates challenges to aggregate the agriculture production to be sizable and attractive for the private capital. And the last but not least is about the limited access to finance for the farmers. As we know, farmers still constitute a significant portion of the agriculture sector, while there are lack of collateral, credit history at the farmers level that impede their ability to access finance. So these are basically the roadblocks, the issues which are still happening across the countries.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wahyu, and very interesting. I think you do have that exposure to farmers in member countries, and you know that IDB has a private sector arm, ICD, but also they have a trade finance arm, which is ITFC, and that brings me to our next panelist, Dr. Harun, who is leading the trade finance solutions, the IDB group. Would love to hear from you about how what are some of the challenges that you see, for example, from the perspective of ITFC? I know Mr. Wahyu mentioned disruption of supply chains, and we have all seen this, especially during the last COVID-19 pandemic. Can you shed a bit more light on these challenges that you face from the perspective of ITFC?
Thank you, Dr. Dalal, and I'd like to also thank the organizers for giving us this opportunity. Very timely event. With regards to the barriers of the agricultural finance in general, I'd like to share my most recent article, which was published in the Agricultural Finance Review magazine. We conducted a survey with the farmers, 1,900 farmers from 37 provinces of Turkey, and we asked the farmers the question, what is the biggest barrier you are facing when you try to get agricultural finance? So, not surprisingly, 80% of the farmers are saying it's the cost, pricing. So this is the demand side. The second one is the tenor, the third one is the collateral. So this is the demand side of the equation. And as a practitioner working in the Islamic finance for several years, on the supply side, the same questions. So why should a private bank or even a multilateral bank invest in an area if it doesn't match the cost and benefit perception of the equation? So first of all, the barrier is the pricing. The second one is the perception of the riskiness of agricultural finance. Is it real or is it a myth? This is a question. Our study conducted with 1,900 farmers in Turkey was saying that no, the agricultural finance sector doesn't have to be as risky as you imagine. When we look at the non-performing loans and the defaults, etc., you don't see the agricultural finance as significantly different from the other sectors. But there's a perception that this sector is risky. It is not validated. From the financier point of view, if you manage to design the product in a way to mitigate the risks, definitely you don't have the issue of default. From ITFC's experience since 2008, we don't have any single default in agricultural finance. There are sometimes some delayed payments, which is normal because the nature of agriculture finance is seasonal. So there would be some delays. But confident I am saying we don't have any single default in our books since last 16 years in ITFC in agriculture finance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harun. And this is very interesting because, as you rightly say, there is a perception that the agriculture sector is very risky, and therefore you don't see much exposure to it in the portfolios of investment and financing portfolios of many institutions. And I think the idea of this webinar and the work we're doing behind is also to change this perception. So we were actually redirecting some of these private sector flows to the agriculture sector. And you did mention the design of products, which is a very interesting point that brings us to innovation. And that brings me to my next question to the panel. When we talk generally about sustainability, a lot of people would raise the long-term cost or the short-term cost of, integrating sustainability measures. But at the same time, advocates of sustainability will highlight the opportunities that sustainability integration would open up, whether in terms of, market opportunities, reputational-wise, etc. So where are you seeing momentum that provide hope and models for finance in the transition? So where do you see the opportunities? And perhaps this is also to provide some insights to our audience. Among them are bankers, among them are private sector institutions, also policymakers. So how can we benefit from these developments actually to unlock other opportunities? If we follow the same order, I believe, starting with Dr. Sabine.
Yes, absolutely. So we see momentum in various aspects. So the first one I would say is that with the rise of climate transition finance, so this form of financing that encourage companies to reduce their carbon footprint, we see a push of the supply chain downstream to reduce their Scope 3 emission. But that means for all these manufacturer, retailer, to trace the origin of the production up to the farmer and to help them to shift to more sustainable practices. So this push could actually bring this capital that is critically needed at farm level. So I would say it's one of the momentum that we see that is encouraging. A second one, and I believe Sarah might be able to discuss it more than me, is the fact that we see a growing interest into carbon and biodiversity credits. And these could be another alternative source of financing for the farmers. As we all know, the agri-food sector is one of these rare sectors that could potentially absorb more carbon than emit. Finally, I think we are going to discuss it further later on, is the rise of all these IT solutions that could actually facilitate considerably this link that we were mentioning previously between capital market and the farmer. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sabine. I think definitely we will discuss later about digitalization, which is effectively unlocking a lot of opportunities for all sectors, including when it comes to food security and the agriculture sector. But following up on the aspects, I know, Sarah, you're also doing a lot of work at CSL on, you spoke about the climate, nature, nexus, etc. Where do you see the momentum, like talking about all of these challenges, but also building on what Dr. Sabine has said in terms of reducing carbon footprints and then carbon biodiversity credits and digitalization?
Thank you. So I would say there's kind of a couple of categories of momentum that I'll speak to. One from the policy landscape, which I think is really helping create more of a supply arena when we think about nature financing. And so seeing the signing of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework in December of 2022 gave us that North Star the same way the Paris Agreement has for climate change. But I think a really big outcome out of COP28 is the effort to combine the NDCs, the National Determined Contributions, and the NBSAPs, the National Biodiversity Strategy Action Plans. And so part of this COP28 joint statement was that, achieving the near and long-term goals of the Paris Agreement and of the GBF requires addressing these things together. So I think having that policy push and seeing kind of a wider international policy landscape change around that will help with the downstream way that financing comes to action. But I think secondly to that, a lot of really exciting industry action in 2023. So we saw the release of the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which builds off TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which released in September of 2023. And in January of this year, they had 320 organizations that have signed up as early adopters. And this includes 18 trillion in market capitalization. So companies that are really starting to go through the process and understand their relationship with nature from an impact and dependency point of view. But I think second to that, within the market, we've seen a really big uptake in sustainability-linked bonds. So Brazil had issued a sustainability bond that was 6 times oversubscribed. So the market is clearly recognizing the value of this type of financing mechanism. And I was able to find Environmental Finance did an overview of the landscape of sustainability-linked bonds in 2023. And they found that it was a record year. There were 255 bonds worth $150 that were brought to market that have different nature-related components along with climate and social. So I think one other piece further to this that is helping build momentum is that Business for Nature, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and the World Economic Forum all came together in 2023 to produce 12 sector-specific nature-positive roadmaps. So on the sector specifically, what can you think about? What does good look like? What does ambition look like? What does the process look like to really start embedding the value or understanding the value of nature within a company's operations? So I think both of these pieces is creating some really good momentum in the space. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I think definitely it's very interesting that on the policy side, a lot is happening, and we see already the impact on the markets, and of course, taking into consideration as well the recent EU package on sustainable finance. All of this is definitely like impacting the markets, and we hope to see similar shift here in the region at the OIC level. So I think leveraging on all these trends, and when we talk about momentum, we talk about, you know, at the global level, but going back to Mr. Corné, do you see the same momentum in all the markets? I know you're exposed to, you had exposure to 3 different regions, so Europe, Africa, and then Asia, but do you see the same momentum in the 3 markets?
Yeah, actually, I'm also quite positive. I'm working with leading local financial institutions, and what I experience is that they all want to enter into the food and agribusiness market or to expand their portfolio in food and agribusiness. And what is interesting is that sustainable development requires a long-term investment. And as you might know, bankers in general are quite short-sighted. They are looking for short-term returns. And that comes together because we have seen that sustainable business concepts correlates with lower risk ratings. So in other words, if banks focus on sustainable clients or clients that pursue sustainable practices, it comes with lower credit risk profiles, resulting in higher risk-adjusted returns short term. So if bankers are able to select the right clients, the front runners pursuing sustainable practices, then it's also interesting for local financial institutions. And I think that's really important to build up the infrastructure from the inside out so that each country can improve their financial sector.
Thank you, Mr. Corné. I think, yes, these are definitely very interesting insights, and also for, you know, the consideration of, you know, policymakers, but also in the private sector. And I would like to move to Mr. Corné. Very interesting. I know you have you're working with various institutions on advisory capacity and taking into consideration the challenges and the barriers we've discussed earlier in the previous question. Where do you see the momentum? And mostly from the OIC perspective, where actually you've done a lot of work in the region, where do you see currently the momentum and models for financing the transition?
Thank you for that question, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to wherever you are. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. First of all, to touch on that with kind of the hope aspect. If we were having this discussion 2 or 3 years ago, the risk factor of agricultural projects would definitely be one of the key drivers to why there's a lack of capital applied from lenders or investors. But because in the last few years, as you know, we've all gone through a global pandemic, which has created huge disruption in supply lines. This has caused kind of a shift in food strategies of countries to look at more nearshoring or onshoring production, looking at alternative models to maybe have an indigenous supply of a critical food supply. Coupled with the disruption that we had in the conflict in Eastern Europe, where that was really a massive impact in the Middle East and Africa and Asia to access to key food commodities. So the first thing I would say in terms of the hope is that the spotlight is now on this sector. And that is really driving. And it's coupled with the Sustainable Development Goals, which is where the investor, the capital markets are looking at. It's also merging, as Sarah mentioned, with the climate change agenda. We're talking about agricultural land by virtue of their production of agricultural produce and also neighboring forests. They are essentially opportunities for these developed countries to use their carbon credit to provide to developed countries. So that's another source of funding that they can touch into. And I think what has really seen the game changer is how we are looking now more at the entire value chain of the food ecosystem. One of the risks was mentioned by Dr. Harun Shalik is a perceived risk. And I think that's very true. And the greater application now that we have seen of digital solutions, Internet of Things, where they are collecting data and seeing how the risks are along the chain, we are finding that it's more of a perception and it's manageable. He did mention there was some late payments, but there are creative ways where we could have smart financing contracts which fit more along with the seasonal structure of agriculture. And if we do that, I think we can overcome a lot of those hurdles that I mentioned. And I just want to point at it in Corné, Mr. Corné's comment about the lack of communication. We have the capital markets, you have the multilateral development institutions, and then we have the farmers. I worked for 15 years in a multilateral development bank, but at the same time, a lot of my projects in the last 2 years are working with farming cooperatives. And there is a complete disconnect in language that is across the board, on not understanding, and also not dealing with the social, cultural aspects of how you bring cooperatives together. And I think one of the key areas which bridges this gap would be the national development banks, which need a bit of scaling up in their own capacity to bridge that disconnect between the two. So I think hopefully that provides some insight.
Thank you, Conor. We'll talk later about digitalization, definitely in the context, of course, of some market case studies. I think a lot of issues were raised by the panelists, and that shows, the various perspectives. There are policy-related challenges, there are funding access challenges, affordability issues, communication issues, which are very interesting. And then there's also a need for more innovation, product-wise, but also looking at the full supply chain when designing the right solutions to address food security. Let me now focus on the policymakers' angle before we look at actually the aspects of financial innovation and digitalization. And I want to direct this question to my dear panelist, Mr. Azamat Kamil, who is actually the program manager at IOFS. IOFS has a strategic mandate actually to focus on food security at the level of OIC, IOF at the level of the OIC, sorry. In light of the challenges highlighted by the panelists, and then of course where the momentum is currently, Could you tell us more about the work that IOFS is doing currently, whether it's in the form of specific programs or policies or partnerships to actually support, the development of the agriculture sector, agriculture productivity, but also taking into consideration, the sustainability challenges that we have discussed. I know this webinar series is part of these initiatives, and I had the pleasure to attend your program here. We had a big summit in Qatar last year, which was focusing specifically about the investment and financing opportunities and challenges. But I think we'd like to learn more about the current work and maybe some of the future initiatives you're planning in this regard.
Thank you, Mr. Dalal, Dr. Dalal. Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here with you. So, as you said, at first, let me brief about our organization. The Islamic Organization for Food Security is a specialized body of Organization of Islamic Cooperation. We have 41 member countries. We have 16 strategic programs. Our program covers key aspects of agricultural development and food security. But here I want to highlight some tasks facing the organization, such as providing expertise and technical know-how to member states in various aspects of sustainable agriculture, rural development, and food security as well. Our focus in these directions is on enhancing the potential of our member states through capacity building in topics like climate smart technology, water resource management, biotechnology, public governance, and others. A lot of aspects, angles we cover by our program. Surely, in our work, we closely collaborate with our member states, and without their support, many initiatives are bound to fail. However, we also understand that moving forward to implement and operationalize innovative agriculture practices is challenging without the right funding. That's why, since last year, IOFS has been working on establishing a fund for this purpose, which we named the IOFS Fund. Let me briefly give some information about IOFS Fund. The fund will be concentrated on the growth of food production, trade, and financing gaps in agri-food sector. The fund structure includes capital entry points, asset management, fund deployment, and making impact to agricultural and food security development. It adopts a type of funding structure to attract various investors. It assumes that capital will come from institutional and strategic investors, as well as perpetual contribution from donor into WACF account, which will be part of the IOFS fund. Investment go into capital protected structures and development projects aligned with the fund's objective. The fund aims for pragmatic balance, preserving investor capital while using assets for development. I would like to emphasize key feature of the fund, let's say unique of these funds. As I said, the triple funded option, which include investment and donations. This enables the long-term sustainability of the funds and covering of operational expenses. Second, institutional and strategic investors allocate capital to the IOFS fund in exchange for partial income return on their investment. The capital will be protected and hedged through financial instruments like zero coupon sukuk and total swap return. At the same time, strategic investors stand out by having a strategic interest. They are open to take on some risk by participating in development projects, which hold strategic importance for them. This is briefly about our initiatives that we call IOFS Fund. So totally, in my point of view, regarding the role of multilateral bodies in this issue, of course, I will say something very trite. It's trite, but the role of multilateral organizations, like providing financial support, expert opinion, coordination efforts, multilateral organization could bring together countries and business sectors and civil society, creating broader and more effective financial mechanisms.
Thank you, Mr. Azamat. I think this is very interesting. And definitely we look forward to seeing, I think, the implementation of the IOFS fund. I think it's a very interesting structure that aligns, private financing, but commercial financing, and also, a social aspect of it through the WACF, which is a very interesting. And we hope that actually it supports the member countries that you mentioned. I want to build on this. Of course, this is from the perspective of IOFS, mentioned 41 member countries. That also provides a platform for collaboration and knowledge sharing and also partnerships. I think earlier we did discuss about the unique support from MDBs through, of course, Mr. Wahyu, Dr. Haroon. But I'd like to come back to Dr. Haroon to better, understand the role of multilaterals, specifically in the case of IDB and ITFC. Multilaterals, we know, have a unique business model. And they also have a number of, member countries, and they provide a platform also for knowledge sharing, for technical assistance, for partnerships, etc. So can you please elaborate more on how MDBs, or what is the role of MDBs in mobilizing finance for sustainable agriculture?
Thank you. Dr. Dalal, we know the share of agricultural in economy is diminishing in all over the world, but still it has a significant importance in the economic productivity and the labor market. But despite this fact, the share of agricultural sector getting from the banking industry doesn't match its significant share in the economy. So let me start from that. And one of the key roles of the MDBs is definitely to close this gap between the savings and the capital on one hand, and the needs on the other hand. So here I have a figure. The United Nations Addis Ababa Action Agenda on Financing Development is facing a significant challenge. And the OECD estimates is the SDG financing gap is around $2.5 trillion. So the gap between the SDG goals and the ODAs is around $2.5 trillion. So this is a huge number. So what would be the role of an MDB? Going back to the previous question regarding the barriers, I believe the MDBs have a unique position to address all the barriers. So if the pricing is an issue, the MDBs have usually a AAA status. So we are proud of being AAA institutions. But what is the benefit of being a AAA institution if you are not able to reduce your cost of borrowing and provide concessional financing to your clients? So there is a role for MDBs to leverage on its unique position as AAA institutions. Similarly, if the issue is the barrier is the collateral, the risk side of the sector, then again, you are an AAA institution as an MDB or a very high rated financial institution. So you can play an intermediary role between the private sector funds and the end beneficiaries and share the risks and provide a better risk profile to the funders. So this is the second, I think, important role MDBs can play.
Thank you very much, Dr. Haroon. So definitely, I think MDB's unique business model, and we've seen that in, I think, some market transactions where the AAA rating, as you mentioned, facilitates reduced cost of funding, or also supports in the form of guarantees, also technical assistance. I think these are all interesting support mechanisms, and which add to the global, agriculture financing landscape. Now, we spoke about MDBs, we spoke about some of the also multilateral organizations that provide this knowledge sharing and, capacity building like IOFS, but also which aims to mitigate this financing gap. And now, if I go back to Ms. Sarah and talking from the policy packages, again, looking at policy makers, if we consider, for example, other enabling factors like policy packages, including fiscal incentives, public co-investment vehicles, risk-sharing tools, some of the regulatory requirements. Can you shed some light on what policy packages show most promise to align and mobilize capital markets with sustainability goals in agriculture?
For sure. I mean, I can give you a bit of a flavor of my opinion on the question, recognizing policy is not particularly my wheelhouse. But I do think that one of the key initiatives that is going to drive a lot of momentum and is starting to do so is the work of the Network for Greening the Financial System, which put out a publication in September 2023, a conceptual framework to guide action by central banks and supervisors on nature-related financial risks. And this has been demonstrated through the work of the central banks of the Netherlands, of France, Brazil, Malaysia, Mexico, and the European Central Bank to really understand from a macroeconomic point of view what is really at stake when we think about both climate change and nature loss and the way that they can exacerbate one another, but the way that they can also be solutions to both problems as well. So I think that has been a really exciting development. And I think that will be really exciting to follow in the coming years to see the way that kind of from a higher level starts to influence the economy. But I think a really innovative, or I guess what we're starting to see more of is these debt for nature swaps. So to give an example, in case there's anyone on the panel or who's listening today that maybe has not heard of them, the debt for nature swaps are an interesting mechanism where there's an opportunity to buy back debt at a discounted rate and use the savings of that to go towards different nature activities. So for example, in Belize, the Nature Conservancy and the government of Belize were able to complete a $364 million debt conversion for marine conservation that reduced Brazil's debt by 12% of GDP. And that created an estimated 180 million in conservation funding over 20 years. So I think this is a really exciting way in which we can combat two problems. One, when we talk about the debt sustainability issue, but secondly to that, the way that we can use that towards solving the current climate and nature loss crises, which we know are kind of a house of cards building on society flourishing and livelihoods and well-being. And I think an exciting piece behind that, again, another outcome from COP28, is that there's a global task force that is launched between MDBs and climate funds to scale the number and size of debt for nature swaps. And the Nature Conservancy estimates that 2.2 trillion worth of emerging market debt globally, or as much as 800 billion is potentially ripe or well suited for these types of initiatives. So I think those are two really exciting things. One, which there's a piece that we put out from CISL called Everything Everywhere All at Once, just ahead of COP28, and I'm happy to pop a link in the chat. But it's a piece to really talk about what needs to happen at scale, and it's everything everywhere all at once. But one of the initiatives that we highlight, and a colleague of mine, Dr. Mohsen Gul, spoke to, is supporting the Bridgetown Initiative, which includes expanding MGB's lending for climate and SDG by $1 trillion USD, raising the access to concessional finance, and assessing funding eligibility in light of a country's vulnerability and providing low-cost 50-year loans to help invest in climate resilience, in water security, in pandemic preparedness, and access to renewable energy. So I would say those are the three things. NGFS, creating this conceptual framework to really drive central banks. Secondly is debt for nature swaps, looking like they've got a really exciting curve ahead of what's possible. And thirdly, the Bridgetown Initiative to really help unlock more funding.
Thank you, Sarah. I think these are interesting initiatives, and it shows how important collaborations actually at the large scale or a top-down approach to actually bring in the right actors to design either the right initiatives or the right instruments actually to unlock more private sector funding. And you spoke about NGFS, which is very interesting, and we've seen similar organizations as well trying to come up either at segment level, banking level, or capital markets, etc. And the aim again is to actually promote collaboration to come up with innovative solutions to unlock more private sector capital. And I know one of the other organizations which has been actually particularly focusing on the debt capital markets, but has been very successful in providing the right definitions, the right frameworks and taxonomies to actually create or support investor confidence, but also to scale up harmonization when it comes to actually a debt capital market mobilization for sustainability. And this is particularly talking about climate bond initiatives. And the question is, Dr. Sabine, on if you can share with us your expertise with CBI and how harmonization actually acts as a catalyst in successful deployment of financial instruments for sustainable agriculture.
Yes, absolutely. I think the key message has already been said, which is that we need to have a common language to understand where we put the investment. So we need to define what are the sustainable practices that can be financed, because we need to make sure that they have an impact, we need to make sure that they are credible, and we need to give this reassurance to investor that what he will be financed will indeed have a positive environmental outcome. So for that matter, Climate Bond Initiative has just finished developing a new sector criteria for the agricultural production, and it will be released in the coming months. And I strongly encourage all of you to have a look at it, because with this criteria, we are explaining how these instruments, these sustainable instruments, so sustainability-linked bond, sustainability, use of proceeds bond, and so on, can be structured to ensure this credibility in the market. I would add that this framework that we have been developing can also be used by the financial institution, because all these institutions nowadays are also creating their own sustainability finance framework, and we need to make sure that there is an harmonization, as we said, between these frameworks, so that we can build these collaborative instruments. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I think, yeah, we definitely look forward to see the standards. I think it's very helpful for the organizations. A lot of things are evolving when it comes to food security and agriculture. And again, if we look at the full supply chain, we need more standards covering the various aspects, not only the production, which is the agriculture, but we see a lot of development even when looking at the use of proceeds in the green bond market. And if we extend it to the sustainability linked or even social bonds, we see a lot of innovation and a lot of structures covering other aspects in the food supply chain. I would like to come back to Mr. Corné and talk about so we spoke about the multilateral perspective in overcoming barriers to investment. We spoke about the role of harmonization, some of the innovations when it comes to developing, for example, new instruments or mechanisms like the debt for nature swaps or carbon and biodiversity credits, etc. So in the context of mobilizing finance for sustainable agriculture, the role of innovative financing mechanisms has become increasingly pivotal, and we do need more innovation. So how do you assess the potential of these mechanisms in overcoming the barriers of investment in sustainable agriculture, and particularly from the perspective of the developing markets you worked at, and where the risk of financial return might be perceived as higher?
Yeah, thanks. A very interesting question. I recognize the innovations at policy level, but also, for instance, at our bank, we issue a lot of green bonds, sustainability-linked loans, all great stuff. But in my personal opinion, there's still a disconnect. A disconnect in terms of ticket size. In many situations, it starts as of $25 million. And that's by far too much for many local banks in emerging countries. Most of the cases, it's a little bit outside in instead of inside out thinking. So is it really the solution for what is needed on the ground? And the instruments are not always that flexible. So I would say a flex fund solution would be very interesting. And thirdly, you have to be a doctor to understand the frameworks. So looking at the mechanisms, it is a little bit a development country thinking, looking at how we measure carbon sequestered, how we have to comply with the ESG regulation. It is by far too complicated. And then thinking about the local context, working with smaller farmers in Ethiopia, how to measure, how to help banks in that particular context, it is really challenging. So I would say we have to focus on the disconnect between the developed countries and the mechanisms developed by those countries and the developing countries. And I would say we have to involve them more directly and start from that particular perspective instead of starting from our own perspective.
Very interesting, actually, looking at the disconnect between what we do in developed countries and developing countries. And it's actually true, like, and I think one of the comments that also similarly was raised is, do we have to, someone who is facing, for example, extreme poverty, do we help him access food, or we talk to him about sustainability and ESG, etc. So it's a long debate, and it's very good that you raised this point. Not sure whether we have the answers in this panel to this question, but it is definitely an area that requires policymakers' attention on how to adapt maybe some of the strategies to the context of the country they're operating at. And that brings me actually to add to this point to Mr. Corné. I know we spoke a lot about the challenges facing the agriculture sector, like the seasonality of the cash flows, environmental risks, market price fluctuations, etc. So can you, to build on to what Mr. Corné said, I know you have also good exposure, particularly to the OIC region, where actually you have differences between the level of development of their economies. Can you share some insights on the strategies and mechanisms that can be employed to enhance actually the financial attractiveness and resilience of these projects to potential investors and lenders, and particularly, again, focusing on emerging markets?
Thank you for that question. Maybe I would just preface my comments, but I wish I had met my long-lost brother, Corné, a long time ago, because I just echo everything he said. I've been fighting that corner to make people understand the disconnect. And maybe I'm in the privileged position, but I've worked from the bottom up as well as the top down, and I can see that disconnect. Thank you for that intervention. The unique challenges of the agricultural sector, I think we touched upon them. One aspect is related to risk, and that's brought up. There is a perceived element, but there is also a real element. Commodity prices do fluctuate, and that is a key factor in determining bankability of the projects that we look at. Having said that, that shouldn't always be an excuse, because if you look at another area where I work in mineral exploration, mineral prices go up and down and have fluctuated dramatically in the last few years, but there's no shortage of funding for that sector. So I think sometimes we use some of these risks as an excuse, but it's more because we don't understand how things work. To echo what Corné was saying, is you really have to drill down to the ground level. And it means a lot more hard work, rolling up your sleeves and understanding that entire ecosystem. What does help, to improve creditworthiness is the use of collaterals. And this is one of the areas where agriculture does not directly lend itself always to having the appropriate collateral in place, especially when we haven't spoken today too much about it. But when we look at Islamic finance is really using the equivalent of the bond, which is the sukuk, required on tangibility criteria, required on having those tangible assets. That sometimes is a little bit of a challenge in some types of agricultural projects. I wouldn't say all, but just in some types. And governments have a role to play, I think, in supporting this. They can be a catalyst for mobilizing funds to bring that attractiveness to the project by providing subsidies and tax exemption to the inputs to the project itself. When we talk about some of those risks that we cannot avert, for example, the fact that it could be a poor year in terms of crop yield or some weather-related risk, And the other element is insurance. And I think insurance could be applied and especially to the agriculture sector. And one of the entities in the Islamic Development Bank group is ISIC, which is the insurance arm. And we have in the World Bank, you have MEGA. So there's a lot more application to help to de-risk some of this cross-border finance that could be applied to agriculture. In food security, what we hear about in the literature is, people talk about cap bonds and financial derivatives application to kind of mitigate or hedge the risk of price volatility in agricultural projects and commodities, sorry. What I would say about that is that don't forget they are costly financial instruments. They're normally developed by international investment banks. They work very well for countries like in the GCC, where governments are looking to stabilize their supply lines of their critical food commodities, but there's an upfront cost in that. So when we're talking about emerging economies in the OIC, this is probably not lend itself in the same way. I spoke about having structured financial contracts. And I think Corné mentioned about the flexed kind of model. We could have flexible repayment schedules. We could have grace periods which trigger in when there's low income season yield or when there's a climate event. We could make that flexibility in the structure. It just requires the lawyers, let's say, to be a little bit more creative when designing the legal contracts for the finance. Also, I think just to point on, because I think it leads very well to our friends in the developmental financial world, is that blended finance. And I think we need to speak about that. That is a very common tool. It's a powerful tool to de-risk projects in that regard.
Thank you, Corné. I think these are interesting points, and it's the insurance fund is definitely interesting, or takaful in the case of Islamic finance. And we know that there have been a lot of innovations based on forecasts as well, like parametric insurance, etc., where you can actually link the insurance mechanism to forecast whether when it comes to environmental risks or other initiatives or other crises like pandemics, etc. So these are definitely innovations to be considered when it comes to also scaling up financing for agriculture. And to build on your point about Islamic finance, I would like to direct this question to Mr. Wahyu. I know Islamic Development Bank is a multilateral organization, as we said, but which activities are based on Islamic finance principles. Can you maybe share with the panel how these principles and mechanisms may be particularly effective in channeling more financing towards sustainable agriculture within actually OIC member countries? And if you can share some current initiatives and projects where some aspects, like what mentioned with the previous panelists, like the disconnect between developing or some resilience issues, is addressed also through some of these structures. I know Conor mentioned blended finance, but we know that there are also other mechanisms like social finance, etc., which actually support some of the underprivileged groups.
That's right. So in terms of the Islamic finance characteristics and the principles, obviously it offers very unique possibilities to support the food security and the agricultural productivity. And for example, the Islamic finance focus really on the shared prosperity. So the Islamic finance instruments like the Mudarabah, Musharaka, these promotes the profit and loss sharing between the investors and farmers. It's also useful on the contract farming. And secondly, the Islamic finance, as we all know, it revolves around the community-based approach. So Waqf, or the charitable endowment, and zakat, the obligatory charity, it can be channeled to provide financial resources to rural communities and support the small-scale farmers. Within the Islamic Development Bank, we have an Islamic microfinance facility, and we have been providing these facilities across the member countries, mostly through Qardul Hasan and Wakala. And this is to support the small-scale farmers to invest in production technologies, inputs, and the infrastructure. We also starting to promote the value chain financing to finance the various stages of the agriculture production, processing, to promote really the efficiency and the access to markets. And we are also supporting the government to strengthen the guarantee part of the microfinance facility. And this is basically to reduce the cost of funds, which would be ultimately be borne by the beneficiaries. In our experience, the Islamic microfinance facility, when it's really targeted by providing the technical assistance as well, this and the focus on the productive asset with profit and loss sharing mechanism, this tend to have a better results and more sustainable when we compare it with the conventional microfinance facilities. So this have been really the work and the ongoing development being done by the Islamic Development Bank, as well with the partners in the agriculture sector in the member countries.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wafi. I think this is very, these are very interesting instruments. And I know in some cases you also have co-financing with other multilaterals or other development funds. So you have an Islamic tranche and then a conventional tranche as well. So that unlocks also a lot of opportunities for collaboration and also to scale up, you know, the financing for agriculture. And to build on to the points listed by Mr. Wahi, I would like to invite again Dr. Haroon and to talk about this very specific area. We know that within the OIC, we have an issue of promoting intra-trade between member countries, and that has been a challenge. You spoke about the decrease in percentage, you know, contribution of the agriculture sector to the economies in the OIC. And then, so we'd like to hear from you more about the work that ITFC does and what innovative instruments, partnerships is ITFC looking to implement specifically to unlock greater trade flows and private sector participation, supporting sustainable agriculture in IDB member countries.
Yeah. ITFC, as mentioned, is the trade finance arm of the ISDB group. So our area is limited to international trade financing. And since the inception in 2008, we provided more than $75 billion of trade financing to our member countries. So roughly speaking, annually around $7 billion. So here, what I would like to highlight is the topic here. We are talking about the resource mobilization for our funding. More than 60% of our funding is mobilized from the market. So this is something maybe not very well known, but it's a great achievement. And even addressing the first question you have asked, is there a hope? Do I see a hope? Yes, there is a big hope. Last year in 2023, ITFC has ranked first in the Bloomberg's leading book runner and mandated lead arranger list. As an MDB, we are the top resource mobilizer in the Islamic finance industry. So how it works, simply I'd like to explain. So we have big ticket clients like the governments, Egypt or Pakistan, let's say, and they import strategic commodities such as wheat. So ITFC launched a syndicated Murabaha deal and goes to the market, the purely private sector banking market. And we mobilize funds, and we are talking about billions of dollars. So only last year for Egypt, for financing their strategic food commodities like wheat, we provided more than $2 billion, and most of it is mobilized from the financial market. Similarly, we have export financing for the West Africa, basically for groundnut and cotton. The big clients, including Burkina Faso and the Gambia. Again, we are mobilizing funds for this pre-export financing. And finally, I'd like to mention something we call the structured trade financing, basically the warehouse financing. Going back to Dr. Connor's comment regarding Islamic finance and asset-based financing, ITFC has developed its structured trade financing scheme where we provide funding for the warehouse financing, where the financier is holding the ownership of the property, of the commodities stored in the warehouse. So this is a good, unique example in a niche area, which is proven to be a good way of Islamic financing, and also to provide funding for the agricultural sector in a secured way, and very successful, alhamdulillah. So these are some major areas I can share. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Haroon. And definitely the area of trade, sometimes we notice that in some countries is a bit neglected. So either we don't have solutions addressing all of the challenges, like you mentioned, when it comes to warehouse financing, or even supporting in export financing, providing the necessary, financing mechanisms that target, the various categories of, stakeholders in the full food supply chain. That's also critically important. I would like to now go back to another area, which is still a niche market in many jurisdictions when we talk about risk mitigation, which is actually talking about, and I know, Sarah, initially you spoke about this nexus between climate and nature. Could you tell us a bit about the work that, for example, CISL is doing when it comes to the nexus between climate and nature-related financial risks, and what's some of the use cases that you have produced at CISL?
For sure, thank you. So maybe just to speak about the climate-nature nexus. When we think about nature as a whole, it's composed of both biotic and abiotic elements. Biotic being natural resources. So this could be plants growing, trees growing, this could be bees, this could be bears, it's nature. But from an abiotic side, we also have climate. So understanding the climate that these organisms are living within. But second to that is biodiversity. What is the richness of a particular area, which may not be biotic in nature, but it is a representation to how diverse and healthy a particular area is. And so if we think of nature being underpinned by natural resources, climate, and biodiversity, we know that climate is one of the key elements when we think about nature more broadly. So what we are approaching with the work that we're doing at CISL is really making sure that our content is hitting this nexus, that we're not thinking of either camp in isolation, that we're thinking about it as a holistic system. And this is this has been born out of a series of publications that we've been focused on since 2019, which was kind of the creation of a specific nature work stream within the Center for Sustainable Finance. And for context, this is within CISL, we convene 50 different global financial institutions to create applied research on how we can really move the needle and drive action as we think about integrating sustainability into the financial system. And so on this nature risk piece, in 2019, we put out a publication to understand what is land degradation, what is biodiversity loss, and how does that actually result in something financially material. And from there, we created a handbook to say, okay, when we think about that nature-related risk, it manifests as a result of what, which translates into what impact on a company, and then further, what impact on the wider financial sector. And so in creating this handbook, we also created 5 use cases. I say we, this was before I was at CISL, so I personally was not part of this journey, but tried to detail, okay, what does this really look like in practice? And so we did this with some of the financial institutions we work with. One includes Rabo. And so what we looked at is land degradation in Brazil and understanding what does that look like over the value chain. And there were a few interesting pieces from that scenario analysis that came to fruition. Firstly was that the small scale farmers, which is probably it's very much fitting with the conversation today, are the ones that really were hit the most. Some of the large scale farmers were able to keep enough capital over the series of years of the impact coming back from this, but small scale in particular really struggled, and also understanding down the value chain. So it's the pre-production from the fertilizers, the production from the actual production of whatever agriculture product it is, and then perhaps that's feeding livestock, and then perhaps that's creating more consumer food packaged goods along the value chain, but recognizing like in that last camp, there was valuation decrease of 45% in the scenario analysis. So really trying to paint the picture that this is a serious economic risk and there is serious financial materiality to it. But I think in saying that, we've done a lot of work on detailing the why, but it's important to detail the how. We understand why, but how do we actually start to act and understand what momentum forward looks like? And so last year we put out an engagement guide for the frontline staff of banks and investment managers on how they can leverage existing conversations on climate with the portfolio clients they have, with the investees that they're investing in, how they can start to use those conversations on climate to start to bridge into conversations on nature. And perhaps the financial economy in this regard could be a leader in catalyzing the corporates they work with to think about these risks if the corporates aren't thinking about them already, and can pull in different material of what exists in the market. Like I mentioned, WEF, WBC, SD, and Business for Nature putting out these sector roadmaps on what action specific to a sector can look like. So that's kind of the piece that we focused on last year, and very fitting to this conversation today. The path for 2024 is really understanding how do we mobilize capital towards nature positivity. And in doing so, we really want to unpack and understand what does it mean when we think about conservation financing versus restoration financing versus sustainable land management financing versus climate adaptation financing, because these are all somewhat umbrellaed under nature financing today. But as I think it's become quite clear through this conversation, they have very different risk and return profiles. So really understanding where private capital, blended finance, public capital, or philanthropic capital may be best suited for the type of nature financing that we're trying to do. So this is very much a work in progress right now, but we aim to have a publication out in October. So if anyone is interested, please reach out. Also, just stay tuned for more on that in October. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sarah. I think this is very interesting, and we look forward to reading the publication. And definitely, as I mentioned, there's a lot of opportunities in this area as well. The nexus, I know a lot of people has been looking also at other areas of the nexus, like looking at energy, at water, etc. But nature actually embodies all of these aspects, and it's definitely one area to be looked at, which also has an impact on financial stability. And it's also from a regulator's perspective, it's very interesting to also take into consideration. Now, I know the discussion is very interesting, and we're a bit, close to the end of the session, but I would like to dedicate the remaining few minutes to one of the very fast, change in landscape impacting, it's also a trend impacting the global financial industry in general, which is digitalization. And I would like to start with Dr. Sabine. I know we spoke about harmonization earlier, and we know the work that CBI has been doing. You've been also monitoring the green bond market, and you've seen also green sukuk and how the market evolved in terms of the use of proceeds that are targeting agriculture or food security in general. Can you please tell us more about the steps needed to harmonize standards and, of course, to address the interoperability barriers and align incentives for financial institutions to leverage the emerging digital technologies responsibly in order to scale up sustainable agriculture financing?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the key developments of the last few years is the emergence of this application, the usage of smartphones, and the fact that now farmers can actually inform easily from the moment they do have access to this technology on the practices that they are implementing on the field and on the impact that these practices have. And this is actually paramount now if we go on the other side at the level of the capital markets, because investors, they need to understand the impact they have. So we finally have the tools to actually bridge that gap between the impact at the farm's level and the impact that an investor needs to see to justify their investment. So I think it's a very important development, and it's still ongoing. There is a lot to be done. And as we already said, this is not simple, simply because there is not one single practice that has to be implemented. The agri-food system is very complex. You have a lot of different practices that can be implemented, and this is the farmer that better than anybody else know what should be implemented. So we need to create that chain of knowledge from the farmer up to the investor And these tools will massively help that development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sabine. Very insightful, and definitely, I think it's a collective effort. And of course, we see how digitalization is impacting various markets. And I want to turn back to Mr. Corné. I know you have a very interesting case study to share from India on digitalization. I would love to hear from you about the open digital ecosystem for India's food and agriculture sector, and how that can be potentially replicated in other markets.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, indeed, very interesting. What you see is that farmers are service seekers. So you need multiple solutions for multiple challenges. And I think an open ecosystem is really important to onboard other partners as well, to offer services through the digital channels, and creating a digital ID for farmers so that they can build up a track record and make it easier for financial institutions to offer loans, other financial services to those farmers. And India is ahead of the market. So for us, an interesting playground to see how we can create solutions at scale. And what is important is that you reduce your operational costs close to nil. Otherwise, it won't work for farmers. Secondly, you have to work together with other partners. So we work together with a leading input provider. We work together with local financial institutions, with startups. That's also important to create that particular ecosystem. And finally, in my personal opinion, you have to work on, we call it phygital, which is a combination of digital and physical infrastructure. So only focusing on digital is a one-point solution. So you have to include physical solutions as well to improve, for instance, cold chain development or warehouses. So it should be an integrated opportunity. India is the playground, but we are also doing deployments in Kenya, Nigeria, and it seems quite successful. So it's for us a very important year to show solutions at scale.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Corné. We'd love to see a replication of the solution in the OIC, hopefully. I think all our colleagues here are very keen to explore innovative products, etc. So that could be a very interesting solution to consider in other OIC countries. And just to build on that from the perspective of ITFC, and very briefly, Dr. Haroon, I know you mentioned a few initiatives that ITFC is doing to scale up trade finance among OIC countries. Is there any consideration for digitalization, for example, how ITFC aims, for example, to leverage on digital platforms and other technological innovations directly facilitate improved trade among member countries?
Yeah, sure. Innovation is definitely key for ITFC's success and strategic priorities. I just want to give an example here how we use digitalization to improve the trade. As mentioned before, we provide financing for Burkina Faso's cotton export to Asia. So this is traditional international trade. So the paper-based shipping documents are circulated among the stakeholders between the banks and the supplier, which is costly and time consuming. And during the COVID time, the problem was worsened, and very often the shipment arrives before the documents, shipping documents, which leads demurrage, which is very costly for both parties. So what we did, we partnered with a digital platform provider, and we provided a solution for electronic circulation of the shipping documents, and in a secure, transparent, and efficient way. And we reduced the transaction time from 21 days to 5 days, including the payment process. So this is a good example how the digitalization can support improving the international trade in the agricultural sector also.
Thank you very much, Dr. Haroon. And definitely it is a very interesting area. We see a lot of innovation in this area, either through the various technologies, AI, blockchain, smart contracts, etc. And we hope to see more of these initiatives moving forward to scale up trade finance among member countries. And I would like to briefly ask Mr. Corné to discuss from the policy perspective. I know you worked with policymakers, but also with the private sector. As policymakers consider opportunities to accelerate capital deployment towards sustainable food systems using emerging digital platforms and analytical tools, what do you see as more of the forefront governance challenges and build spots that need to be to get ahead of?
Thank you for that challenging question.
Yes.
It does start at that level. Just one thing I say, has anyone spent long enough to read through vision and statements of countries, especially African countries? They're not like a lengthy read, 100 pages, but the problem with them is that because things are changing so fast, these vision policies that governments have built for 2030, 2040 in some cases, they're not keeping up with the developments on the ground. Things are changing very quickly. Governments, though, however, are, especially in emerging economies, are looking for innovative ways. People think very connected to what's happening at the global landscape. They're part of these meetings with the World Bank and Islamic Development Bank. They know what's happening, and they either culture in African countries, they're very interested in exploring digitalization, not just for the finance aspect, which is obviously where everything has started, but actually looking at applying this as a game changer in the traceability of products, especially that's probably more in the meat industry. But even if we apply for agriculture, is the technology that can be applied for refrigeration. There's sometimes that is just one area that stops products in Africa getting into European markets because of the hygiene requirements that need to be complied with. But I know there's a lot of innovation, and this is probably what I just want to speak to as maybe a final point. There's a lot of African entrepreneurs in the agricultural tech industry. Agriculture is 75% employment of a lot of African countries, so it's a major part of their economy. And there's a lot of interesting tech. Now, in Uganda, where I have a lot to work in, there are about 200 innovative patents being issued. Only about 9 of them get to commercial development. But even because they work in that space where they require venture capital, there's a disconnect between where the capital flows are coming from the bond market or multilateral. So we need to connect, especially for the venture capital development of African entrepreneurs. I think that's in short supply. Just an interesting example, just to finish off with, which I find where is the hope and potential. To think about a desert country like Saudi Arabia would be exporting tomatoes and vegetables to Europe, which started just 2 weeks ago for the first time in its history. Just goes to show what the application of technology can do to make sustainable and resilient solutions.
Thank you very much. Definitely, there's a lot to explore in the context of OIC. I think the good thing is we have a lot of good practices to leverage on globally. And the challenge is to support actually policymakers into considering some of them, but of course, taking into consideration the disconnect that Mr. Corné mentioned between developed and developing countries. I would like now to briefly ask Mr. Azamat from the perspective of the IOFS. We spoke about so many trends and emerging, practices at the global level, and we spoke the reason of one of the recent initiatives and of course trend that is also shaping the agriculture sector, but the global financial industry digitalization. Can you tell us more about some of the initiatives that IOFS is actually doing in this regard? Is there any interest that you see at the OIC level about all of these emerging technologies such as smart contracts, Internet of Things, blockchain, etc.? And what is the work that you are planning in the coming months or so to actually support all of these initiatives and leverage on these trends?
Thank you very much. Of course, there are no any doubt this technology can provide transparency, security, and efficiency in financial management. And of course, collect, analyze data for more accurate decision making will be used. For example, if we utilize IoT data and other system like IoT data, we can create more accurate parametric indices for insurance and risk management. Actually, Dr. Dalal, I'm not big expert on this issue, but would like to share my experience, my personal experience on how digitalization helps to improve farmers' access to financial resources. Against the backdrop of more than 30% decline in agricultural lending by second-tier banks, the government of the Republic of Kazakhstan has taken comprehensive steps to address the situation. To address this, digital solutions were introduced. First, this weather index-based growth insurance. Secondary, transparency and trust through automation of grain receipts and other documents that will use widely used as collateral in Kazakhstan, and implementation of new automated digital products like agriculture receipt system and others, and digitalization and optimization of subsidies of government subsidies. All these instruments, based on my experience, significantly exchange this accessibility fairness to the financial resources. And I just want to say that I totally agree with esteemed panelists that digitalization is a big solution, especially for small and medium-sized enterprises, especially like informational and analytic systems like Clara Clara platform, United States platform, very useful for small and medium-sized enterprises. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Azamat. And it's a very passionate discussion. I think all the panelists have a lot to share. It's a very interesting topic. There's a lot to be said when it comes to mobilizing sustainable financing for agriculture. Unfortunately, we have actually exceeded the time of the session, and I believe my colleagues at IOFS are actually raising it. So we have to conclude the session, but just to summarize what has been discussed in the session, clearly there are a lot of opportunities to scale up, agriculture finance, leveraging on sustainability and digitalization. There are, of course, differences when it comes to the status of development of countries. So this should be taken into consideration by policymakers. There is need for harmonization when it comes to the enabling frameworks, taxonomies, definitions, new concepts or strategies that are being developed. There is need to unlock more private sector funding and to efficiently leverage on multilateral and public sector financing to scale up sustainable agriculture. There is need for actually dedicated financing mechanisms and incentives to support some of the underprivileged groups like small farmers or SMEs working in the food supply chain. It is also important to consider other aspects of the food supply chain beside actually or beyond agriculture, which mainly focuses on production. But if we look at the broader food supply chain, there are many other aspects that need more financing, that need more enabling actions by policymakers actually to properly or to efficiently support food security. When it comes to digitalization, we see differences in terms of the practices, but clearly the use of technologies like blockchain, smart contracts, AI, or Internet of Things, all are very interesting aspects or technologies to consider for unlocking more private sector funding. But also there is need to create more synergies between Islamic and sustainable finance. From what we see, both are still evolving in separate markets. And in future, it would be interesting to also develop more synergies in terms of in the product development side, in terms of the governing frameworks and principles, and also in terms of knowledge sharing and capacity building at the global level. I would like to thank my dear panelists for accepting our invitation and also for sharing their insights and their experience on all of these aspects. I would like to also thank the participants for staying with us and sharing, of course, some of the questions. Unfortunately, we don't have time to address all of the questions, but good thing is we will have a report, an event report from today's webinar. So we will try to address some of these questions in the event report itself. And of course, you can write to us whenever, if you have any other questions or comments or remarks. I know the IOFS colleagues have been very supportive in addressing all of these. And I would like to thank you all and stay tuned for the next webinars. We have some interesting topics to be discussed in the upcoming webinars, as I said, under the Food Security and Sustainable Development webinar series, which is a joint collaboration between the Islamic Organization for Food Security and Hamad Bin Khalifa University in Qatar. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a nice day.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.